Welcome to All of This and More. I'm excited to talk to Emely Rumble about her new book, Bibliotherapy in the Bronx. Emily, will you take a couple of minutes and tell us a little bit about you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Charlotte. I'm Emely Rumble. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, school social worker, and the author of Bibliotherapy in the Bronx, coming out on April 29th. I've spent over 15 years working as a therapist, and my passion lies in using stories as tools for healing. I specialize in bibliotherapy, a creative, culturally affirming approach that blends literature, expressive arts, and psychotherapy to support mental and emotional wellness. I'm also the founder of Literacy NYC. That's the name of my private practice where I work with children, teens, and adults, often incorporating somatic healing, trauma informed care, and neurodiversity affirming modalities into my therapy sessions. As someone who is from New York and also someone who's Afro Latina, Black American, and Puerto Rican, I bring both my lived experience and my clinical expertise to my work as a therapist, especially in school based and community mental health settings. And outside of that, I'm a mom of two, a proud wife, and a big fan of spontaneous kitchen dance parties with my children and our dog,
Wonderful.
Montana.
And thanks for including the dog. Let's not forget Montana.
We cannot forget Montana.
So how old is Montana compared to your
He
kids?
turns 2 in June. So him and my son are both cancers. So there's a
Okay.
lot of emotions and
Well, Montana is the baby.
he's my baby, yes.
Okay, great. Well, it's so good to see you online. I wish I could see you in person, but this will work for now. We're going to start with a conversation about your reading and writing life and then move into more specific questions about your book, which I love. I'm so glad to have this book. And this episode should go live on April 29th, which means this is the day the book is ready. So please buy it and read it and share it with anyone who appreciates storytelling, the power of books, the power of reading. I'm so thrilled to have this book in the world. So, congratulations. And
You.
before we talk more about the book, I would love to hear more about how reading and writing help you belong to yourself, others, and the world.
Yeah.
Okay.
I always go back to something that Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop said that is foundational to me, which is that books are windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. Books are mirrors that reflect us back to ourselves. Windows, a sneak peek into the life of another, and sliding doors, which allow us to step foot in someone else's shoes. So for me, reading is such a regulating practice because it allows me a practice of stillness. It allows me to engage in a practice of self-reflection. I love how when we're reading, we can really turn inward and experience our emotions and allow our thoughts and fears and deepest desires to come to the surface where they can be witnessed and felt. Judgment, right? Reading is such a deeply intimate personal thing when done alone, and then it's a beautiful way to connect with others when we're buddy reading or when we reading in a book club and things like that. So reading is such a integral part of who I am, how it's a hobby, it's a coping mechanism, it's my job. It's a lot of things. And in terms of writing, writing is healing because it allows us to really attune to ourselves, our own voice, our own thoughts, our own feelings and ideas. I think the world can be really loud. People around us can sometimes be even louder with their own wants and needs from us. And sometimes other people's voices echo more strongly in our minds than our own. And that can really like drown out our own needs and wants and our own connection to our intuition. So, engaging in a writing practice, whether that be journaling or working on a project, I think it brings us back to self. And that's really important.
I wish we could talk about just that question for an hour, but we will move on. Although your book, I mean, the whole time I was reading it, I was like, yes, yes, this is belonging. This is like so much of what I've explored and researched, and reading about all of it through the lens of bibliotherapy was so enlightening and interesting.
Yeah.
So, another question, what has nourished you over the past few months?
Yeah, yeah. Lately, I've been really into sound baths. I'm working with a spiritual teacher who specializes in sound baths and sound healing. And I've been loving that because I'm a big journaler. So when I'm journaling now, I always play some ancestral healing or, healing frequency, no words, just a sound bath. And it's really enhanced and enriched my journaling. I'm also really big on like scrapbooking, and I have a journal ecosystem, in other words. So I have a ton of journals, and they're not all for the written word. Some of it I just use to doodle in, some of it I use to color in, some of it I use for symbols, archetypes. My journals are full of a bunch of different ideas, scraps, words. It's just like a process that I go through, and I just write or draw what I want. But engaging in that practice that's tethered me to myself for all these years while having like a sound bath moment is such a healing exercise that I'm really enjoying. And I think because my life feels so chaotic right now as the book is preparing to launch, those moments, even if it's like 20 minutes a day, are so soothing and so regulating to my nervous system.
Okay, I love that. I can see you journaling in this healing space, and
Yeah.
it sounds lovely. Thanks so much for sharing a bit about that process. All right, I'd love to hear a little bit about your writing life. So, what aspects of the writing life typically deplete you, and what about the writing life nourishes you?
Yeah. I just love to write without the pressure of deadlines. I think that feels really depleting because it's performative in a way. I think so much of authentic writing has to happen like naturally, and things rise to the surface when they're ready to be expressed. So when I was writing bibliotherapy in the Bronx and I had deadlines, that was my first time working with strict deadlines. And there's so much shadow work that goes into getting the words on a page. There was so much excavation that had to happen in order for me to meet those deadlines and still write from an authentic place. I'm glad that I wrote this book over 10 years because I don't think this is something I could have written in a year or two. I don't know how writers who are professional writers, how writers do it. That felt very depleting to me. The nourishing part was, well, one, the feeling of success in getting it done and getting it done my way in my voice for its intended audience, honoring Black librarianship, honoring my ancestors, like that feels really good to have written the book that I want to write, to have written the Black librarians and social workers and in our communities that have contributed to the field of bibliotherapy who are unsung heroes. I'm so incredibly proud of that. It was a tremendous amount of research, lots of, digging into the archives and um, reaching back to the past and also reaching like within. I tell a lot of personal stories in the book, and also I share some stories of my clients. So that was nourishing to have my clients ready and willing to share how literature has helped them heal, and then to edit their segments with them and for them to feel nourished in telling their story, because that alone was excavation for them, right? Coming to therapy, believing in the process, trusting in me, trusting in themselves, and being guided through literature on a healing journey that ultimately ended up in their healing from trauma, being able to integrate parts of themselves that they were super ashamed of, or feeling like, okay, how do I keep living with the grief? How do I navigate this depression? Can I still be happy? And so that was so nourishing, and it still is nourishing because now the book will come out and other people will read these stories and be inspired. So that nourishes me.
That's so interesting to hear your thoughts on putting the book together, and the kind of good parts and hard parts of that. Do you remember when you first had the idea to write this book, and like what made you want to write it?
Yeah, yeah. I don't think I had one like aha moment. where I knew that I would write a book. I think, I started journaling my reflections after particularly intense therapy sessions or school social work days. Over time, those reflections started to form a pattern. And people would always ask me, like, are you going to write a book? You should write a book about what you do and how you do it. Like some therapists who had never heard of bibliotherapy or poetry therapy that were a part of my supervision groups or a part of the places where I worked were very interested in the work that I did and how I did it. And so I was always asked, like, are you going to tell us more about how you incorporate literature into your work? So it occurred to me that here I am doing this work in the privacy of my therapy room. I'm seeing how often literature helps me reach people, especially young people in schools who didn't trust adults, right? Seeing how stories allowed even parents to reconnect with their kids after rupture. Being a school social worker is such a dynamic job. You're working with, you know, the students and then their caregivers, and then you've got like the school itself supporting the teachers and the administrators. So this book just kept whispering to me, like, it's time to write. Just write it down. And so it took several years, honestly, to feel like I had enough that would encompass a book. But I think between my clinical practice, between motherhood, grief, right, and life, the pandemic, which is why I started Literacy NYC. My son was diagnosed with autism during the pandemic, and my daughter was born during the pandemic, and I had a brush with death. I had COVID when I was 9 months pregnant with her. And so that was really a time where I was like, okay, now is the time to like piece this all together and put a manuscript together. Um, and I'm really glad that I did. And I'm really glad that I held on to all those bits and pieces because sometimes when we write things, we can be the most critical of our writing and we can just like check things away or so I had a little collection of my writing over time and it became Bibliotherapy in the Bronx.
Well, I love that other people were asking you to write the book. Like, that's usually a good sign.
Yeah.
If you have a lot of people asking you when you're going to write a book, it's typically something to consider. And I'm glad that you listened and moved forward and took notes and held on to things that would be included. And I will say, I was wanting more. Like while I was reading it, I'd read a section and I'm like, I could read a whole book about that. So I hope you keep writing and I hope you give us more books in the
That's
future.
really encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah. So one question I have about the book and your work is how writing the book and putting these pieces together might have helped you notice something you hadn't noticed before about your work. Does anything come to mind, like what surprised you through the writing process about your work?
Mm, wow. I think that because people always ask me, how did I become a bibliotherapist? And we focus so much on like education and credentials and stuff like that. But really, it started out with my inner child. Literature gave me language when I had none. I grew up in a home where mental illness went untreated, and often I felt physically and emotionally unsafe. So for me, books were more than just like a literary escape. They were literally anchors. For me, my grandmother raised me and she was very sick throughout my life before she passed when I was 14. So there were things that I was seeing and having to figure out and make sense of for myself. And so I learned about myself that I'm very guided by my inner child. And that even though she was so vulnerable as a young girl, I know when my grandmother passed when I was 14, I go into foster care and I legally emancipate myself at 16, and that's all in the book too. But I think that that little girl who was so curious and so brave and so clear about who she was, maybe not about why things around her were happening, but clear about who she was. Shout out to my first grade teacher, Miss Parkins, who taught me how to read and got me my first library card. I hadn't realized how much my work as a writer, as a healer, as a light worker is informed and really guided by my inner child. She's pretty
Okay.
badass.
It is. That's amazing. I love that. And I love that through the writing process, you return to that and were able to recognize it more.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear a little bit from your book. I have a few prompts for you to read some passages, and then I may have questions after you read each one. The first one is 200 words or a couple of paragraphs that you wrote because you needed to read these words.
Yeah. I don't know if this is 200 words, but I'm reading on page 102. This is where I write about one of my favorite poets, Adrienne Rich. Adrienne Rich was a prominent American poet, essayist, and feminist icon whose literary contributions left an indelible mark on the landscape of 20th century American literature. Her style as a poet is characterized by bold and unapologetic explorations of complex themes, including gender, sexuality, politics, and identity. Rich's poetry often employs vivid and evocative language, making extensive use of metaphors and imagery to convey her ideas and emotions. These lines always resonate with my clients, no matter what walk of life they come from, and with me, which is why I'm reading it. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes, the words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. Doing the work of healing while self reflecting and bringing our awareness to painful memories and experiences that have impacted us feels like exploring the wreck. This is also a great metaphor to explain why it takes time to see outcomes in psychotherapy. Where there is a wreck, there is lots of damage, there is wounding. It's best not to dig, but to go slow, to sit with and observe the wreckage, to give ourselves time to process the things that will never be the same.
Amen. I mean, there are so many wrecks in
So
life
many wrecks, yeah.
and around us right now, and that we can see about to happen, you know. So you read this portion of the book and bringing this image of a wreck into our minds from Rich and her words. And like, what is your relationship to that passage now? When you read that now, what comes to mind?
Yeah. What comes to mind is how much I have had to let go of and grieve in this process of becoming a debut author. In order to move into this next season, I've had to let go of so much that I love and that I hold dear. But in this new iteration of me and my journey and myself, I have to allow myself to be transformed. And that's hard, right? Like I shared with you before we started recording, leaving the Bronx on the eve of my book coming out was hard. My husband accepted a position in a new state, and so we live in Massachusetts now, and saying goodbye to my community, my home, my clients, it's familiar, right? You come out with a book and people suddenly begin to view you differently. Sometimes that's not such a bad thing because you learn who truly supports you and who doesn't, or who doesn't have the capacity to be happy for you. And that's hard. So when I think about, exploring the wreck. It's kind of like the tarot card, the tower. Everything's kind of falling apart. It's a death, but there has to be death in order for a new beginning to arise. And so that's really what speaks to me in this season of my life right now.
Thank you for sharing that. Is it weird for someone else to ask you questions that you might ask your clients?
Yes. Yes, but I've already had to ask myself a lot of the hard questions to write this book. So I feel like it comes much naturally to me now. Like, had you been asking me these kinds of deeply emotional, spiritual questions, a couple years ago, I'd be bawling on this podcast episode. But I've done a lot of the work to get to this point. So talking about it is the easy part.
Great. I'm so glad. So, can you read a passage from the book, an excerpt that represents, at least in part, the mind, body, and soul space you're inhabiting right now?
Mm, yeah. Okay, I'm reading from page 105. In the words of author Jeanette Winterson, fiction and poetry are doses, medicines. What they heal is the rupture reality makes on the imagination. For some individuals, the way back to connection with imagination is easiest through a poem. Poems are usually shorter than stories, yet have such powerful stories to tell. Stories about our inner worlds and how we experience the outside world. Stories that distill the essence of our human nature into just a few lines. Sometimes a poem can be 3 lines long and pack a therapeutic punch that provides just enough enrichment to help elicit some emotion. I immediately think of Lucille Clifton's Out of Body, where she writes, I am saying, I am trying to say from my mouth, but baby, there is no mouth.
Clifton. I love Lucille Clifton.
Yes, may she rest in power.
And I love your words on poetry and how you honor poetry in your life and in your work. Are there any poems that are helping you navigate these current days in addition to
Yeah.
the words from Clifton that you just read?
Yeah, I've been reading a lot from Frederick Joseph actually. He recently released a collection called We Are Alive Beloved or We Alive Beloved. I love that collection so much. The and maybe this is connected to the inner child piece we just talked about because the cover of the collection is like a little black boy in this textured collage holding a balloon up to the sky. It kind of reminds me of like a Banksy art piece, but it's textured in like this sepia black and white, overcast shadow. And the cover drew me in, but then I started reading the poems and I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm obsessed. And Frederick actually has his first young adult novel coming out in May, and I was honored to read an advanced copy of it. It's not poetry, it's a narrative, but it's a story about Ozzy, who is a young black athlete who gets a scholarship to go to this prestigious school, a basketball scholarship, but then he has an ACL injury and he can't play. He is totally depressed because now this shatters his entire identity and sense of self, being a black boy, being one of the only black boys from a different neighborhood going to this prestigious school for basketball, and he can't play anymore. But he ends up learning that he's actually a really great writer, and he gets into this writing program in the school where he's encouraged to write his poems and his essays, and he starts reading the work of James Baldwin and really tapping into his identity as a writer. And there's a line in the book that says something about to the effect of like, how would you live differently if you considered your life as a poem? And I love that so much. So I've been like holding that in my heart lately, like how would I live differently? How would I navigate this anxiety differently? How would I, hold space for my grief differently if I consider that my life is a poem? And that's just like really anchored me in this time leading up to my book release.
That's such a beautiful question to consider. And you said his book comes out in May.
Yes, it's called This Thing of Ours. It's his first young adult novel and it comes out in May.
Okay, poets are my favorite prose writers. Like,
I
I'll fall in
agree.
love with a poet and then I'll read their fiction or nonfiction or essays. I'm like, "Ah,
I
they
agree.
they're the
Philip B.
best."
Williams, one of my favorite poets, he recently released Ours. That's his novel. He has a few collections. Mutiny is my favorite, but he came out with Ours and I loved it. Honoré Fanon Jeffers, one of my favorite poets, she wrote a collection based on the life of Phyllis Wheatley. She wrote the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. That was her first novel. Oh my goodness. Like I am here for poets who write novels. I am so here for it.
Yes, yes. Have you read Martyr by Kava Akbar?
Oh my goodness. I've read it like 5 times and I look forward to reading it again. I love that book. I use that book often with clients who struggle with addiction.
Oh, that's
His,
wonderful to hear.
yeah,
He's one of
his
my
work
favorite
and Tommy,
writers.
beautiful writer, beautiful and poet. Reminds me a lot of Tommy Orange. And I didn't know they're actually friends. They're very good friends, which makes sense.
Yes, they went, I mean, I know this from Instagram. They went on a book tour together recently in California, and I was like, do I want to fly to California to see them? I like actually considered doing that, but I didn't.
I wish I had major FOMO seeing that. I was like, this is literally the book tour stop of my dreams, and I can't be there. Ah,
Exactly. Maybe they'll they'll come together again one day on this side of the country, or in a way where we can be there more easily. So one more prompt and passage from your book is a couple of paragraphs from the book that you wish people who love you would read and reread regularly.
Mm, I love that. Okay. This is actually going to be on page 149, Embracing Stories of Trauma and Healing. An important aspect of narrative therapy is the mindset shift from a victim mentality to understanding all the ways we each resist oppression. Even where conflict is present, each of us puts up some kind of fight. Nobody openly receives oppression without resisting in some way. As humans, we are inherently wired to survive and resist any harm being done to us. This is a major mindset shift for someone who has been made to believe they've had no agency in life. The entire heart of a narrative therapy approach is about centering ourselves as the main character of our own lives and owning everything that happened before us, around us, and to us. It's about putting agency and power back into the hands of the client. It's about helping the most conflict averse client understand that there's a fighter inside of us all. In therapy, it's like being the hero of your own story. You're not blamed for what happened to you, but you're given the power to change how your story goes from here. It's about realizing that even if life has been tough, you still have the strength inside you to keep going and make things better. Many people start therapy because they're looking for answers. We want to understand why things happen and why they've happened to us. We want help making the larger connections to draw meaning from experiences that are hard to accept. Clients often come to me burdened with the inner conflict that emerges from being cast as a villain in someone else's narrative. Reading offers us the profound gift of self reflection, helping us discern whether our turmoil stems from conflict within ourselves, discord with others, or the broader landscape of social issues. Just because you've been cast as a villain doesn't mean you are one, and it doesn't mean you can't change the narrative.
Part of the book. And I will say, as I was reading, your exploration of archetype and shadow self and those things were really intriguing to me and helped me think more broadly about the books I read and why I love the books I love. And when books disrupt me and disturb me, like, why is that?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with how we relate to villains and being thought of as a villain or being or even making mistakes that we can correct, hopefully, or
Yeah.
have an opportunity to have reconciliation or restoration.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that's an important piece for me as a social justice oriented therapist who uses bibliotherapy. That piece around reconciliation and redemption being possible is so crucial to not just our personal healing, but our collective healing and well being. You see this with like cancel culture. We're so quick to want to like cancel someone or cast someone aside, and we've kind of forgotten how to be in relationship to one another. And we've kind of forgotten that it's possible. It's possible to heal. It's possible to change. You absolutely have to make amends where you've caused harm, but you can change. No one is like subject to a life sentence of having to stay one way. There will be challenges, and especially if we're talking about mental illness, I don't want to oversimplify it either. There's definitely challenges to overcome and things to be addressed, right? But I'm just really glad that you brought that up around reconciliation being an important part of this work because absolutely. What happens when we've convinced ourselves that we're too broken, we're broken beyond repair, right?
Can you speak a bit more about bibliotherapy for the collective and for all of us, and maybe some hopes you have for this moment that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking with a librarian yesterday who's writing a piece on bibliotherapy in the Bronx for the school library journal. And she was asking me, I said something to her about how for me, like censorship, book banning, and things like that, it's a mental health issue. And she was fascinated by that because she was like, I never thought about it as a psychological issue. I thought of it as like a political issue. And while it is a political issue, like for me, I consider it a mental health issue because when stories censoring the voices of those in the margins of BIPOC, queer, disabled, neurodivergent lives, when those stories are censored or just straight up banned or pulled from shelves, like it sends a message that your story doesn't belong here. And that internalized message can become, shame, silence, and further isolation. And our society doesn't need further isolation. It needs more connection. And so I think that there's a danger involved in, silencing voices of those who society harms the most or who society just straight up doesn't acknowledge, who we want to keep certain people invisible. And that's what's happening. We're seeing it in real time, right? Like the erasure of not just stories, but like people's realities, their lives, their well-being. I have a colleague of mine who's HIV positive, a wonderful clinician, and they were telling me that, with some of the recent legislative changes, they're worried that they won't have access to their medication anymore. I get emotional talking about that because, oh, this is one of like my very close colleagues who I love very much, but hearing, them share that very personal truth with me as I'm also like working with trans kids as a therapist who are saying to me, um, our president, like our government wants me to not exist. Like, what do you say to a 12-year-old who can see it for what it is and is trying to grapple with the idea that, like, there's certain people who don't want them to exist. And so that's why it's a mental health issue and a psychological issue and not just a political issue.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, when you first said it's a mental health issue, I was thinking of the people doing the banning of their mental health
Oh yeah,
issues.
right, right. Talk about it. Talk about it.
But, and of course, I'm aware of the mental health issues surrounding those affected and those whose stories are, who some want to erase. And I think it's, hearing these specific examples about your colleagues and clients, I hope will help others recognize that these are real people
Right.
who are being affected. Like, I think so many people in this country erase the human element when it comes to political agendas. And is whenever we can uplift stories and share stories and and highlight and feature actual human voices and stories, I think that's one of the most powerful ways to combat some of the political tragedies that are happening daily.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thank
I
you for
agree.
your work and thank you for this book, because I think that's a lot of what you're doing and a lot of what you're going to help others do as you spread the word about bibliotherapy. And I'm sure people will want to get trained in it and want to have, their own practice one day, and or even just glean good things to use as a parent or a friend or a partner. And I have so many good hopes for this book. And I'm wondering, like, what are your hopes for this book? And
Ooh,
what do you want to see happen?
yeah. I love that question. Honestly, I just want people to feel seen and validated. I want people to know that, if you're reading as a care practice, you are healing, and to know that we come from lineages of storytellers and that we don't have to depend on society or the government or the president or any of that to like validate us and empower us. And this is something that gives me hope is that, even with the defunding of like the library system on a federal level and some of the other things that we're seeing happen or the efforts being made, right, to defund the education system and things. One thing that I know for sure, just based on my experience, my career, and the people in my life who are doing great work in the book community, in their specific communities, whether that's through free little libraries or book swaps or getting together with other, parents and caregivers to do story time in the park. Like, I know that there are so many light workers in this world. And so I hope that when people read Bibliotherapy in the Bronx, they're reminded of that like we may be all we've got, but we're all that we need. And I think we did see this during the pandemic, and it doesn't take away from some of the harrowing things that we saw, but I think there were efforts that community made to come together, especially in New York City, where we were like fighting for toilet paper and paper towel. I know in my building, we were like, hey, do you have butter? Do you have paper towel? We were sharing resources. And I believe that. I believe that, of course, there needs to be a balance, but where there's darkness, there's light, and there's more light than darkness. I truly believe that. And I think that books like mine remind us of our shared humanity, of the importance of sharing our stories, of standing in our power, of exercising our agency, even when we may feel like, well, who am I? I'm just one person in the grand ecosystem of the world. Like, what influence do I have? If that influence is walking somebody by and saying good morning and giving them a smile, if that's all the influence you have, then that's influence, right? To shift somebody's day, mood, to make somebody feel seen. And so that's what I hope. I hope that my book is encouraging, inspiring for folks and restores hope in our shared humanity and in our personal and collective power.
May it be so.
Yes, I
I
say.
would love for you to close us out with the last words of the book, the
Oh.
affirmation that you included in the end. Can you read that for
Oh, I
us?
love that. First of all, thank you for reading.
My pleasure,
I'm
my honor.
so honored when people have read it because, sometimes you do interviews and people didn't read it or they didn't finish it. So that just means so much to me. I needed to take a moment to say that. Thank you.
Thanks.
All righty. And when you say read the last page, it's the bibliotherapeutic reflection.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Bibliotherapeutic reflection. Affirm to yourself out loud. I am a reader. I am a storyteller. I am always learning. I am forever evolving. I do not have to be anyone or anything other than who I am today. My story matters. My story is still being written. I give myself permission to write, read, and revise.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for closing us out with those wonderful words. It's so good
Thank
to be with
you.
you.